Hey, welcome back to another dispatch from Hollie McKay. Today, um, we're going to visit uh, Ernest Hemingway because Hollie took a trip to visit his gravesite and reflect on the man, his life, and his history. Hollie, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think as a writer and as a war reporter, Ernest Hemingway always has this sort of very legendary status for the wars that he covered, and sort of the writer that he was, and his ability to both do nonfiction and fiction and really dig into incredibly complex subjects, and really an extraordinary man. So I had the opportunity. So my good friend and publisher, Sequoia from D'Angelo Publications, she is based in Twin Falls, Idaho. So I sort of went to visit there, and I found out several years ago that Hemingway was actually buried nearby in a beautiful ski town called Ketchum in Idaho. And so we went to his gravesite initially. I think it was a New Year's Day of 2022, and I remember being really surprised that it was completely covered in snow. No one had been there a really long time, and we had to spend a lot of time sort of shoveling it over. And when we were kind of asking locals, do you know where this is in the Ketchum Cemetery? They were sort of no. And I remember thinking that was so strange for this really iconic figure to not be this shrine or this sort of massive tourist attraction. And so that always really interested me. And I had an opportunity just the last couple of weeks to go back, and I really wanted to sort of dig into why. This is where Hemingway surprisingly spent the last 2 years of his life. And I think we often fixate on his time in Cuba or his time in Paris or his time in the Florida Keys. But Idaho was where he went in and out of for many years. And then that is also where he took his own life on July 2nd, 1961. And so we sort of had the opportunity to go to his residence, which is closed off from the public, and I'll get to that in a minute, which I always found strange. For any of us who've been to Graceland or other places where these legendary figures once lived, they're big tourist attractions. And this just isn't. It's on a private road. It's hidden. You cannot find the address anywhere. We sort of had to be escorted there, and that was by a representative at the local library, who is now sort of in charge of archiving. And when you go into this home, and it's beautiful, it's the most beautiful view. You can see why Hemingway just absolutely fell in love with Idaho, because and this little house, or I shouldn't say little, it was quite big for its time, but it's all still got his things in place. You've got his boots, you've got his last wife Mary's clothes are still hanging up. You've got the magazines, the Life magazines he was reading, photos on the wall, letters he wrote. So it's really this incredibly extraordinary experience where you're sort of right in the middle. You're in the living room that he shot himself, and you're at his desk where he would have done a lot of his writings. And there's just so many things that fascinated me about that experience, most of all, why it is so secret. And so I found out that his last wife, he was married 4 times. His last wife, Mary, also a writer, she passed away in 1986. So she lived for a good 25 years after him and would sort of go in and out of the house. And she left the house in her will to the Nature Conservancy, and she wanted it used for sort of that piece, the purpose of for arts and for nature studies. So that was sort of a little bit of an challenging interpretation, I think. So the Nature Conservancy sort of kept it very serene and very quiet for all these years. And then in 2017, joined forces with the Ketchum Library to kind of do the preservation. And artists do go in and out. There's a sort of a guest house at the bottom where artists will stay, and they'll do a residency there. But it's not, it's very closed. And I think that is to really primarily to preserve Mary's wishes of what she wanted the house to be, and that she wanted it to be just a very underground place that not to be, school groups do go through, and they do have different very small sort of writing retreats and things there, but it's not a place that will ever be a Graceland or some sort of tourist attraction. But it was just a really sort of fascinating study into Hemingway's life in Idaho. He initially went there, sort of a marketing executive, invited a bunch of Hollywood celebrities, and Hemingway was really the only literary figure. So you had all the sort of the big stars of the time that would go and stay at the Sun Valley Lodge, which is sort of the famous ski resort in Ketchum, and beautiful and still there. And so Hemingway went with his then wife Martha Gellhorn, and they stayed for a long period, and he sort of fell in love with it then. And then so it was in the late 50s he ended up buying this home from the former Yankees owner named Bob Topping. It was quite a socialite, and that's where Hemingway kind of spent his last few years, and then it became his permanent residence once Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, and Americans were all foreigners really were being kicked out at that point. And so then he had to make Idaho home. But I think what is also really interesting is that, of course, those last couple of years of his life were extremely turbulent. And you could even sort of compare his writings from his earlier days to that time, and it wasn't quite up to who we knew Hemingway to be as a writer. That he wasn't the writer that he was, 10, 20 years before that. And a really interesting kind of look at that was that he was actually going to the Mayo Clinic for electroshock therapy because they thought he had what is known as bipolar now. Back then, they called it manic depression. But he would continue to get worse. And that always really perplexed doctors because the electroshock therapy really worked, for most people at that time that were suffering with bipolar. But Hemingway, it was causing him to go into a spin where he felt he was losing his memory, he couldn't write, extremely erratic. He was also a very heavy drinker. He was self-medicating with alcohol and pills, which certainly doesn't help. But a really fascinating kind of a psychology a book came out in 2017 called Hemingway's Brain, and it breaks down a lot of these things, and the argument there is that he was misdiagnosed and that he was perhaps suffering from what we now know to be CTE. Of course, you may have heard of CTE being associated with football players or boxers, where you just get continued kind of severe concussions, and that can just cause this sort of brain to not be able to function the way. But it's sort of a brain degeneration, but in a way that there isn't really a cure for it, although there is a lot more studies being put into it now to understand that didn't happen, obviously, during Hemingway's time. So that to me was also really interesting, and certainly the symptoms of CTE matched up with what we know of his behavior to have been in the last couple of years of his life, with suicide tendencies and then eventually going through with that. So I just think it's been more than 60 years since he'd gone. He's been gone, and more years has he been gone than when he was actually alive. But the impact that he has on the literary world is incredibly remarkable.
Yeah, well, it is a fascinating a rich repetition of the history of the man in his final years. And there is no doubt, as a writer and also as a journalist, uh, his exploits in his younger years are, I mean, they're legendary. I mean, Hemingway I mean, it's an archetype, really, and in terms of resolve, strength, and curiosity to go explore the world. And so I'm curious, because so from a personal note, uh, Hollie McKay, as a journalist, has a her own personal history that is very much Hemingway-like in terms of some of the things that you've done in the world and going to places that no one else would go, which was a very much a Hemingway characteristic. And did you feel a sense of like this is somebody you could have related to in terms of your own career as you walk around and explore what you did about this man?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we always look to the people before us because we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for people like Hemingway and like his ex-wife Martha Gellhorn, who was also a terrific war reporter. And you've got to pay, your respects to those people in whatever way you can. Something else that I sort of sat with afterwards that I was thinking about was, Hemingway's still especially in today's age, that's a lot more PC, a controversial figure in his drinking um, and maybe his treatment of women. He was very much a man's man, hunting and loved the outdoors, which is also why he loved Idaho, and kind of had a lot of the characteristics that often critics will say is toxic masculinity today. That's arguable, but I did think about back in the day when, say, youth were looking for that kind of man's man, young men were looking for that male role model in a way. They had people like Hemingway, they had people like Scott F. Fitzgerald, they had the Tennysons, they had these sort of incredibly cadre of incredible intellectuals that were also people that went out to, like Hemingway, to these wars, to the middle of the chaos, that were sort of lived experiences that could come back and translate these things and do these other activities. And I think that's what a lot of young men of that era, looked up to. And I think today, a lot of the guys I know that are maybe looking for that male leadership figure, they're listening to podcasts of meatheads, and there isn't, they're not following, even though there are many, wonderful sort of male journalists out there, that's not who the masses of young guys today are following. They're pretty much just following meatheads that don't have, I hate to generalize, but that don't have necessarily that intellect or that experience or that ongoing experience. It's all sort of past experiences rather than present experiences. And I don't really have an answer for it other than it was just something I thought about.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that it that archetype of that type of person. I mean, I know they follow you because, you know, your own exploits parallel some of the boldness of that type of person. It's an architect of a personality, not necessarily an architect an archetype of a gender role model. But yeah, I think you're right. Like the go out and see it for yourself era is somewhat lacking today from where
We're
it
in this
used.
era of addicted to podcasts and talking about things, but there is a real dearth of doing. And I think that is sort of what's missing in society.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't know. I mean, you and I are not from that archetype. We're the type of people that just kind of, if you see something needs to be done, it's just like dive sometimes blindly to what needs to happen. But yeah, I mean, to visit the gravesite of one of the true greats, that sounds like a fascinating journey, and can't thank you enough for sharing that with everybody because
Read the article.
yeah, well, I did, and it's really, really good. If you haven't read it before seeing this video, definitely go back and go look at the text because there's like details and fascinating stuff in there. Okay, Holly, thanks a lot for sharing that, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.